As evening neared, a violent storm swept over the city. The worst of it finally centering over House Nasardo. There, the tempest appeared to stall, as if a plant setting down roots. It raged and raged with no sign of lessening.
There always seem to be storms,
Zail thought, as thunder once again racked the building.
yet rain is no more evil than the sun or moon. It is only that those who work dark deeds prefer to cloak their evil with it.
He took the thought to heart as he readied himself for his spell work. Zail had the sample of blood from Celine and the tools he would need for drawing up the pattern. She, in turn, promised to bring with her 3 items of close personal value to the late Ria Redan. All they needed now to do was to descend into the crypt. With Humbard in the pouch, the Rathmanian returned to the main corridor downstairs. Celine already awaited him there. Both a lit lamp in one hand stood protectively behind her. The Lady Nasardo wore reasonable attire for journeying below the earth. A riding outfit with green pants and leather boots, besides a similar colored cotton blouse over which was buttoned a black leather vest. A matching belt with a small sheathed dagger completed her ensemble. The noblewoman smiled anxiously as the tall, slim figure approached.
I've brought the articles you mentioned.
She held up a sack that clinked, indicating that at least 2 of the pieces were in some part made of metal. Then, if you will lead the way. Lifting another of the lamps from the nearest wall, Celine complied. Wolf left her to take up a position at the rear. For the bodyguard to choose such a place was a clear sign that, in the crypt of Nasardo, Polth considered Zail the only questionable factor. The necromancer did not find it odd that the family would have its crypt beneath its home, for the practice was not unknown in Luca or the eastern half of the world. The powerful and wealthy seemed especially covetous of their dead, as if their mortal shells were any more value than those of the lowest beggars in the streets. Yet, there was something more to House Nasardo's crypt, something that made the necromancer eager to see it. As Celine guided them through the house, he sensed again the collective of souls beneath his feet, and unidentifiable energies that seemed to either coalesce around them, or that were perhaps the reason for their being there at all. The trio descended a series of stone steps that took them beneath ground level. They passed empty, dust-laden chambers whose burial history Zail could sense from the stark emotional impressions still lingering. Celine suddenly hesitated. Turning to the necromancer, she said,
My family is not without its black deeds, Master Zail.
He nodded, the only answer that his hostess required. As one with a gift, Celine had likely felt the emanations from these chambers throughout most of her life, and so suspected that he now did also. At the end of the corridor, they descended once more. The Rathmanian tensed, aware that they were very near their destination. Moments later, they confronted a thick iron door. Celine held her lamp close, revealing an 8-sided starburst pattern set in the center. Pulse stepped up to the front and, after handing his lamp to Zail, tugged tight on the rounded handle. The bodyguard pulled the ancient door open, a grating squeal accompanying its movement. A torrent of whispering voices rushed up to meet Zail, They spoke not to him, though, nor to any living thing. They were the voices of the very dead he had confronted earlier, the voices of Nasardo's past, reliving their former lives over and over. As Polt retrieved his lamp, Zael noted Celine watching him intently.
Sometimes,
She murmured.
sometimes, I think I hear my ancestors when I come down here.
Lady Nasardo turned and entered. With Polt close at his back, the necromancer did the same. And, as he first beheld the crypt, Zael realized that his visit among the dead earlier had given him only a mere indication of their final resting place. Although the shadows hid the full enormity, the edifice clearly ran the length of the house and beyond. Zael did a quick estimation and decided that it covered most of the family grounds. The ceiling was as high as that of many cathedrals. He and his companions actually stood at the top of yet another set of steps which led down to the meticulously built stone floor. To each side, vaults at least 10 high held the remains of Celine's bloodline. White polished stone markers covered each space, the name and dates of the individual carved on them. The vaults continued on into the darkness, not one space in the immediate vicinity empty.
We will have to walk a little farther.
Whispered Celine, stepping down.
Riordan's place is midway through this chamber.
Are there other levels?
3. One bears the bodies of loyal servants. The deepest is actually not from my family. It was an earlier crypt. The first Nasardos built this upon it.
The Rathmanian's brow wrinkled. Where would one... She shook her head.
You can't descend to it. The entrance caved in some centuries past during a quake. I know of it only because Riordan was always fascinated with our family history and uncovered the knowledge in his research.
More than ever, Zael wished to commune with the late Lord Nasardo's shade. There was much that Riordan might be able to explain beyond Celine's current needs. A layer of gray ash covered the floor. Vague footprints preceded the three. One pair matched Celine's in size and shape. So deep underground the dust came, but came slowly. From the number of prints and their pattern of movement, he knew them to have been created during Riordan's burial procession some years back. Glancing at his hostess, Zael saw her unconsciously retracing her steps. He wondered if she now relived that tragic moment. Deep below the surface they might be. That did not mean the crypt was devoid of life. Scavenger beetles, some as large as Zael's palm, scattered out of sight as the lamps illuminated the way. Millipedes burrowed into cracks in vaults. Most astounding of all, though, were the shroud-like webs draping so many parts of the crypt. Several were large enough to cover a man, and in them could be seen tombs of another kind, the wrapped, shriveled bodies of the spider's victims. Most were other insects, but a few were small rats, no doubt sickly ones to have fallen prey to their much tinier arachnids.
When Riordan died, I had an army of workers clear this crypt of such vermin.
Said Celine with a disgusted survey of the webs.
I can't believe it's gotten this bad again. Where do they come from?
Zael did not reply, for he was instead caught up in the ever-increasing intensity of psychic emanations. Each vault's inhabitant existed in the same dreamlike state, their spirits active when they should have either rested or gone on. The whispers had reached such a level that he was, at times, tempted to cover his ears. They had gone only a few steps more when the noblewoman suddenly paused. A look in her eyes was all the information the necromancer needed, but a glance up at the marble plate just above her head verified that they had indeed come upon the mortal remains of Riordan Nasardo. If you would prefer a moment to yourself, my lady.
No. I've had enough such moments since his death. I cared for my husband, Master Zael, even loved him in a certain way, and likely always will. But now I think it's best to continue with what we must, and leave him in peace.
But the cowled spellcaster was not so certain that it would be as easy as Celine thought. From Riordan's vault, Zael suddenly realized that he sensed nothing. This was the only vault where no spirit was active. Why that? When all the others could not rest. Such questions would, he hoped, be answered very soon. I shall work here, then, he returned, reaching into his cloak and removing a piece of white chalk from a pouch. If I may have some room, please. As Celine and Polth stepped back, Zael knelt. He placed his own lamp next to him, and began drawing a 5-sided pattern. In the corner of each, he drew the 5 elements as Rathma preached them: earth, air, fire, water, and time. In the center, the outline of a serpentine form, and under it a downward arch. This was a simplified version of the symbol representing Tragal, one commonly used for spellcasting. As the fulcrum of the balance, the dragon was bound to all the elements, and they to him. Although the symbol was simplified, the overall pattern was far more complex than Zael had often utilized in the past. Myriad symbols soon decorated each of its borders. The necromancer suspected that all of them would be necessary if he hoped to achieve results. When the pattern was finally complete, he reached into his large pouch and removed Humbart. What a depressing place, the skull growled. I wouldn't be caught dead here, if I had any choice in the matter, that is. From Celine's direction came a brief chuckle, while from Polth there emerged only a grunt. His having expected the shade of Riordan Nasardo to possibly appear at some point. A talking skull evidently seemed far less astounding to the bodyguard. Quiet, Humbart, the necromancer murmured. He placed the fleshless head in the center, over the mark of Tragal. There were times when uses arose for the skull, and this was one of them. As a soul midway between the afterworld and the mortal plane, Humbart Wessel offered a link like no other. He was yet another precaution Zael had put in place to better his chances of reaching Celine's departed mate. Don't know why I'm doing this, Humbart continued to grumble. Them souls are all so flighty, so full of their misery and loss. If I had a stomach, it'd empty from all their whining. That said, the spirit stilled. The Rathmanian retrieved the tiny vial of blood donated by Celine. Then, with the tip of his dagger, drew the contents up onto the blade. He took the weapon and outlined a circle around the skull and the mark. Looking up at the noblewoman, Zael said, "The items, please." Celine handed him a sack. The necromancer reached in and removed the pieces one at a time. The first was a ceremonial dagger with the Nasardo symbol etched into the hilt, a hilt that looked to be pure gold. The edge of the weapon was blunt, the item for show, not for use. The second piece Zael removed was a blue silken scarf such as the Rathmanian had seen adorning the throats of a couple of returning nobles aboard ship. Imported from across the Twin Seas, such an item marked Riordan's high status in Westmarch. Setting the scarf and dagger outside the circle of blood, Zael located the last piece in the sack, a medallion with a golden chain. The necromancer frowned as he gazed upon it. The chain was of recent forging, but the medallion was much, much more ancient. More ancient than the House Nasardo, in fact. The metallic piece had almost been worn smooth by time, but he made out a shape. A head with 8 limbs sprouting from it. Zael frowned, trying to recall anything in his teachings that matched such an image. When nothing did, he reluctantly added the final item to its proper place outside the circle. "I will begin the summoning now," he informed Celine. "It would be best if you were next to me so that your near proximity can enhance our hopes of success." Without hesitation, she complied. Her sudden closeness momentarily distracted Zael, who was more used to performing summonings without another nearby. He sensed her power pulsate with each breath she took, the gift so naturally a part of her that the woman likely did not know the potential she carried. Pulse suddenly stirred. Zael assumed that he was somehow the cause for the bodyguard's reaction, but Pulth, hand on his weapon, instead peered into the darkness farther in.
What is it, Pulth?
Nothing, mistress. One of the vermin, I suppose.
The necromancer held the ivory dagger over the center and began to murmur. He felt energy swirl around him, gathering for the spell. The whispers of the ghosts halted as they felt the intrusion into their plane begin.
Riordan.
Zael silently called.
Riordan Nasardo, husband of Celine. Riordan, Lord of House Nasardo.
Several previous lords of the manor briefly stirred, then returned to their dream states when they realized it was not they whom the necromancer sought. Zael had learned from the earlier incident to focus more, so as not to recreate the havoc he had caused those souls. The crypt had always been cool, but now a stiff chill filled it. Celine abruptly shivered, and Pulth let out a low curse. To the Rathmanian, however, the sudden shift in temperature was a promising sign. It meant that his spell was indeed reaching into the spirit world.
Riordan. Riordan Nasardo. Come to us. Come in the hour of your bride's needs.
A reluctant soul was often more willing to respond if a loved one was so involved. Zael felt the sun stirring. He manipulated the dagger over the pattern, uttering words passed down by Rathma to his followers, words in a language known only to the faithful. And nothing further happened. The necromancer sensed that something wanted to come, but that other forces held it back. Without glancing at Celine, Zael said, "My lady, if you would place one hand on the hilt of the dagger, I would ask then that you softly call your husband's name." She obeyed without question, clearly trusting in his knowledge and skills. Zael adjusted his grip so that she could properly touch the hilt, and focused his spellwork to coincide with her summons.
Riordan?
Noblewoman whispered to the silent crypt.
Riordan? Can you hear me? It's Celine. Please, Riordan. I need to speak with you.
Now the presence stirred anew, pressing closer, but something still held it back. The necromancer had a vague impression of a winged form. He grabbed for Celine. "Down! Something's coming, lad!" roared Humbert. "I think it might be..." A flesh-rending howl filled the crypt, echoing over and over again. Rats, insects, and arachnids scattered in primal terror. From the webs and dust formed a monstrous thing with wide wings, both fiery and yet dry and decayed. Its body was a cadaverous corpse with not even enough flesh left to cover its bones. There was some semblance of a face, a man's, so it seemed, with wisps of hair and even some beard remaining. But there were no eyes left, only black pits, and the howling skeletal mouth was distended beyond mortal limits. The arms, too, stretched far beyond anything human and, like a bat's limbs, were part of the wings. The remaining fingers were twisted talons, clearly capable of shredding. Even as it coalesced, the ghastly shade soared down upon them. Zael had barely thrown Celine to the floor before the fiendish shadow passed directly over them. Had they been still kneeling, it would have gone through their bodies.
What is it?
Blurted the noblewoman.
Is that Riordan?
No, it's a wraith, a damned soul. And what it was doing here now was of a special interest to the Rathmanian. Unfortunately, before he can consider the reasons, he first had to survive the encounter. "Polth, take her!" He need not have even spoken. The bodyguard had already leaned down to seize his mistress. Polth lifted Celine to her feet as if she weighed nothing. He then kept one protective arm around her while with the other he brandished his weapon. But a sword was no match for a wraith. Rolling to his feet, the necromancer brought up his dagger. Not at all to his surprise, the monstrous spirit fixated on him. Wraiths ever thirst for what they no longer had, and spellcasters often offered them a double bounty. Both Zael's life force and his magic presented a bounty. They would not slake the horror's thirst. Nothing mortal could. But that would not keep the wraith from draining him of everything regardless. And then it would go after Celine, who also had the gift. Eyes on the shrieking ghoul, Zael commanded, "Take her upstairs. It will not follow out of the crypt. Go!"
No, I won't leave you alone.
The Lady Nasardo struggled to escape Polth's ursine grip.
Mistress, you must come.
The giant began dragging her toward the distant steps. With a chilling scream, the wraith flew down at Zael. Although its origins had once been human, it no longer had a lower torso. Instead, a savage bony tail whipped back and forth, acting almost like a scorpion's sting. The sinister shade was not in any way corporeal, but if any part passed through the Rothmanian, it would be as if 100 blades had been thrust into his heart. And that agony would pale in comparison to what he would suffer when the wraith began to suck him dry. Muttering quickly, Zael held the dagger up. From the nearest vaults, a torrent of bones burst through the marble. They tumbled in front of the necromancer, forming in an instant a wall whose brilliant illumination matched that of the dagger. Zael disliked disturbing the bones of Celine's kin, but had no choice. The wraith veered off just before it would have touched the bone barrier. It shrieked angrily, seeking a way around Zael's spell. That would not take long either. In truth, such a defense would hold little against the monster, but the necromancer sought only a delay so that he could prepare a better defense. At least with the focus on him, Celine was safe. But then from the shadows, he sensed the movements of others. Risking himself, he glanced toward the darkened steps. "Get her out of here, Polth, quickly! There!" Finally, having determined that the bones were no menace to it, the wraith chose that moment to plunge. As it flowed through the barrier, the bones quivered, and the entire structure collapsed in a heap. Zael brought up the dagger again, but too late. He turned the ghoulish creature aside, but one wing passed through his torso. It was as if someone had stolen a piece of his soul. Crying out, the Rothmanian dropped to one knee. It was all he could do to keep a grip on the dagger. "Zael, lad! There's a foul beast atop the vaults! A big, hairy bastard of a spider thing with fangs and claws. By my lost soul, there's another!" Low, sibilant hisses coming from all sides, even from overhead, now filled the crypt. Several monstrous forms dropped through the thick webs above. Celine screamed. Through pain-racked eyes, Zael saw the darkened figures of her and Polth suddenly surrounded by at least 4 hunching shapes that would have been nearly as tall as the bodyguard if standing straight. They seemed some hellish cross between men and giant black arachnids. Polth held them at bay with his sword, but the creatures moving about on the back 4 of their macabre limbs paced around the pair in clear preparation for a group attack. One opened wide its lipless maw, hissing and revealing a pair of huge fangs such as the necromancer had seen on jungle spiders of the most virulent toxicity. But concern for Celine and Polth faded into the back of his mind as Zael sensed the wraith returning for him. He rolled out of the way just as the specter dropped into the area where he had been kneeling. "Come and try that on me," snapped Humbart. "I'll take you on with no hands to tie you behind my back." The wraith moaned at the skull with a vicious beat of its ethereal wing somehow sent Humbart rolling. He swore as he collided with one of the walls, but his distraction did what it was supposed to. Given the chance to recover enough, Zael cast another spell. A spear of bone formed in the air before the Rothmanian. With a single word more, Zael sent it flying at the wraith. The talon of Trangal was a weapon both physical and mystical. That the wraith had no mortal substance made no difference. The talon's target turned just as the spear reached it. The wraith sought to twist out of the way but moved too slow. Zael's missile tore through its side. A shriek more horrifying than any previous escaped the specter. Still screaming, it turned and vanished into the deeper section of the crypt. Gasping from his efforts, the necromancer looked at Celine and Polth. Their grotesque attackers had finally worked up their strategy. One leapt up onto the vaults, then to the ceiling where it dropped down toward the bodyguard. Polth instinctively shifted to meet it. The moment he reacted, 2 others, the foremost crawling across the opposing vaults, charged Celine. But she was evidently not the helpless figure that they thought her. The crimson-haired noblewoman gestured toward the one leaping at her from the vault, and a bolt of ice struck the hellish Iraqi square in the chest. Hurled back at the wall, it hit with a bone-cracking thud and crumpled in a heap on the floor. Frost covered its entire body and sprinkled the air around the corpse. Celine gaped at what she'd done. The second horror tried to use her shock to its advantage. Fangs dripping, claws out, it lunged for her throat. There was a flash of icy blue light, and in its brief illumination, what appeared to be a shield of some sort came between Celine and the fangs. Howling, the monster pulled back, a paw completely frozen solid. Again, Celine seemed startled at what was clearly her own handiwork. Pulth had managed to avoid the first creature's plunge at him. With expert swordplay, he drove it back, then seeing a moment, turned and ran one through with the ruined paw. But then another leapt out of the shadows, bowling the giant over from behind. Two more of the demonic arachnids joined their comrade in assaulting the bodyguard. Without hesitation, Zael threw his dagger. The glowing blade flew unerringly at his target, sinking into the back of one of the creatures. Hissing sharply, the man-spider spun in a circle, grasping frantically for the deeply buried weapon. The fact that it was still buried there startled the Rathmanian utterly. By rights, the dagger should have returned to him once its grisly task had been done. By blood and sacrifice, it had been bound to his conscious will years ago. If he desired it to come to him, it did. But not now. Only then did Zael understand that he had played right into someone's hand. The sixth beast fell out of the dark webs above him, hissing lustily as it landed upon the spellcaster. The heavy weight crushed Zael to the floor, nearly knocking him unconscious. He felt clawed hands tear at his back, rending his garments with ease and leaving bloody gashes in his flesh. Burning venom dripped onto the back of his neck. But Zael was not easily subdued. He slammed his elbow into his adversary's midsection and heard a satisfactory grunt of pain. Some of the weight vanished, enough so that the Rathmanian could turn on his back and better face his foe. The monstrosity snapped at him with yellowed fangs as long as Zael's fingers. Its breath stank of the grave, yet the eyes were the most unsettling aspect of all, for Zael could have sworn that they carried in them a human trait. Then the Rathmanian's gaze shifted upward, and he saw an odd growth atop the head of the fiend. After a moment, the necromancer realized that it was a separate creature, a smaller spider, but one still larger than his hand. It stared in his direction with baleful red orbs, its own smaller fangs twitching evilly. The revelation almost undid Zael, for his astonishment gave the larger fiend the chance to tighten his grip. The fangs drew near the necromancer's throat, and suddenly a fist struck the monster on the side of the head. The beast tumbled back. Pulse filled Zael's view. The bodyguard's uniform was ripped to shreds, and he had scars everywhere, but he wore a triumphant grin.
My thanks, Master Zael.
Pulth rumbled.
The one you took from me, it was enough. The other two, they fled, having learned their folly.
Sure enough, other than the Rathmanian's foe, the only creatures left were the dead ones. Even as Pulth helped Zael rise, the final creature scurried back up into the shadows. The necromancer frowned. He was forced to acknowledge that he could not magically sense the creatures. They were a complete blank to his abilities. Small wonder that he'd been caught off guard by the one dropping from above. Another concern took over. Zael tried to look past the imposing bodyguard. Celine! Is she?
Untouched she is. but unharmed, I can't say.
Zael saw why. Celine Nasardo stood where he had last noted her, both arms wrapped tight around herself. She stared at the beast she had slain, and Zael knew right then that this was the first life that his hostess had ever taken. That it was some monstrous creature seeking her own death did not matter. Humbart's skull lay eye sockets up. A low mutter flowed from the late mercenary's fleshless head, much of it having to do with wishes for a good sword arm and a pair of legs. Aware that if his companion would grumble so, he was undamaged. Zael went first for his dagger, still tight in the back of his victim. As he stumbled along, he crossed what was left of the spell pattern.
Wait, please, listen, please.
The frantic intensity of the voice suddenly inside Zael's head made him clutch his skull in renewed pain. He concentrated, drawing up mental shields that made the cry more tolerable.
He seeks the moon. The moon seeks the moon. He has it, but it is not the moon, but it is the moon. And if the moon is held to the moon, then the spider will come again.
Zael tried his best to make sense of the rambling words. He knew immediately their source. Riordan Nasardo had finally responded, albeit neither in the manner expected, nor on the subject for which his shade had been sought. But his frenetic tone indicated that this was a warning that needed to be told more than anything else, and that was what mattered now.
What do you mean?
The necromancer thought.
What of the spider? What of the moon?
A vague, misty form drew together near the vault where Celine's husband had been buried.
Spider, moon, spider, moon, spider, moon, moon, spider, moon, spider, moon of the spider, moon of the spider. The time comes, the spider comes, the struggle comes.
Straga? Zael blurted. Something about the name struck a chord. Moon of the Spider?
Zael!
Riordan's presence vanished from his head, as did the shadow on the vault. Zael heard Polt's swearing voice and realized that the one who had called the necromancer's name had been Celine. Look out, lad! Added Humbart. It's back! Strong hands grabbed the Rothmanian, tossing him far. Zael landed atop the very beast toward which he had been heading. His face slid against the hilt of his dagger. He instinctively seized the mystical weapon, tugging it free and spinning around to see what was happening. The shriek that filled the crypt was answer enough even before Zael finished turning. The Wraith had returned, seeking to feast upon the distracted spellcaster. But Polt had thrown Zael out of its imminent path. The bodyguard stood defiantly, his sword out again just as the wailing specter fell upon him. Yet where the Rathmanian might have had some defense, the fighter did not. The Wraith coursed through him without pause, its talon wings seeming to grasp at Polt's chest as it did. The giant screamed. His body shook and his skin shriveled. The sword fell from his crumbling fingers. Polt's desiccated flesh turned to ash, and even before he fell, there was little left of him but a skeleton. The Wraith continued on, its hunger unabated. Celine stood directly before it, the noblewoman so horrified by the death of her loyal servant that she stood frozen. Zael held a dagger before him, point down. He spouted out the words to the spell as quickly as he could. Polt had perished for him. He would not let the same fate befall Celine. The pale illumination spread from the dagger to the wraith, enveloping the winged fiend as if in one of the spider's webs. The wraith shrieked as it still sought Celine, who stood barely a yard from its vile reach. Standing, the necromancer cried, Ult al Ratma! Sian! The light pulled back into the blade, and with it came the thrashing specter. The creature howled and flapped as hard as it could, but was unable to escape the hold. Zael shuddered with effort, for the spell he used drew from his own soul. Yet, if he let up in the least, the Rathmanian knew full well the wraith would have both the noblewoman and him. His spell was a variation of the life tap that a necromancer could use to revitalize himself with the essence of a foe. It was ever a dangerous spell, for in taking in the life of another, one risked taking on the victim's attributes. There were legends of Rathmanians who had literally become their vanquished enemies, necromancers who had then turned to the side of hell until hunted down by their brethren. But what Zael attempted now had even greater risks. He had combined the life tap with a mastery spell, generally used on the recently deceased. Utilized against a common shade, there would have been little risk. But here, Zael sought control against one of the most malevolent of the undead. Worst was the fact that, though what he absorbed now weakened his adversary, it also sickened the Rathmanian. Zael took not a life into him, but the undeath that was the wraith's essence. The coldness that filled the human was one that even a servant of the balance could not tolerate and live. Passing above Pulse's ravaged corpse, the shrieking wraith neared the blade. Zael gritted his teeth. He had one last spell in mind, but he wanted the specter contained as much as possible before he attempted it, or else all the necromancer would accomplish was slaying the noblewoman and himself. Closer. Closer. There! Zael focused on the bodyguard's remains. Pulse's corpse exploded, the anguish of his death a most powerful force. Zael steered that force at the wraith. Amplified by the necromancer's magic, the death energies overwhelmed the specter, burning it away. The wraith managed one final angry shriek and vanished without a trace. Zael tried to unbind himself from the wraith's destruction, but his effort was not entirely successful. The deathly energies enveloped him, and the last thing he heard was Celine's cry.